a director and serves on the audit committee of the PPL Corporation, a public corporation. And Susan is going to be commenting from a unique perspective, but an important one, which is the perspective of someone who serves on the board who has to hear the reports from the other committees and make decisions about retaining management, doing these other things, and also has the insight of being a top corporate executive. And she serves on another little board that suffered in basketball this week, the Board of Trustees of Duke University. She's not alone in that, as you'll soon see. Next to Susan is Robert Clark, and anybody who's a corporate law academic knows Bob Clark because he wrote the single best book ever written about corporation law. He is a professor at the Harvard Law School, and after he wrote that book left the vineyards of academia to be dean, and had an extremely distinguished deanship there. He's beloved at Harvard, and rightly so. And returned to being a professor and is doing that. I'm privileged to actually get to co-teach with him next to another Brown River, Schuylkill, and what's that one up there? The Charles. But besides being really one of the most distinguished corporate law academics and one of the most respected law school deans of the last quarter century, Bob Clark was also a very experienced independent director and serves on the board of, among other corporations, Time Warner and TIAA, where both of which have involved him in activities relevant to our topic tonight. And so we're very lucky to have Bob here. And then to Bob's right is Janet Hill, and Janet went to Wellesley with a presidential candidate. Her husband went to Yale with a president. Janet's had a diverse career, at one point being the special assistant to the Secretary of the Army, I believe. She was in charge of detonating small nuclear devices without detection. No, that was not true, but she's now works with, I believe, the former Secretary of the Army and is Vice President of Alexander and Associates, a consulting firm. Janet is also a very distinguished independent director and has served on the boards of several public companies, notably for our purposes tonight, Sprint Nextel, which has been an interesting saga. She's on the board of Wendy's. I talk to her more often than she wants, about their French fries and how they should be changed. And she's also on Dean. I don't want to slight Dean Foods, which is a dairy. And there'll be a trivia question of how you can connect Janet. She serves on the board of Duke University, but how you can connect her to the NCAA tournament and even to the Super Bowl. To my immediate left is Charles Elson, who is the head of the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware, a corporate law academic, and a wonderful guy and an experienced public company director who got to know Chainsaw Al Dunlap at Sunbeam very early in his director career, and since then has been on boards like as Office Depot. No, what's the other one?
Autozone.
Autozone. Autozone. Your CEO left for.
Went to Office Depot.
Yeah, and he screwed up apparently. But not Charles, but the guy who left Autozone, right? And but Charles is in like a non-pressure position, like as a director of HealthSouth. And so besides being an academic and one who's written a lot about the role of the independent director and how you can get them engaged in the game, he does the real world work of an independent director. So I think with our four panelists, and I don't want to go further, they know what it's really like to be a director and to handle these sensitive issues. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Clark, who's going to kick us off.
Okay. The plan here is that I'm going to first talk about the question of importance. Is this like the independent director's most important role, that is selecting the CEO and planning for a succession and making sure that happens? how important is it, and if and regardless of how important, how well are boards doing it? This is just to see what the panelists think about all this. Let me start off indirectly. I have a clear answer to these two questions, but I'll hold you in slight suspense. Just published an article with Professor Jay Lorsch at the Harvard Business School, which is called Leading from the Boardroom. Just came out a couple days ago. It was originally based on a survey, although the editors didn't want us to put the survey stuff in there. A survey of Fortune 200 boards. We were trying to figure out what independent directors and boards in general thought about various indicators, supposed indicators of good corporate governance. So we had a thing about ISS, basically, and we wanted to see what directors thought about the institutional shareholder services corporate governance quotient, the Glass-Lewis quotient, and other things like that. So we had a lot of questions about how they would rank 52 good governance indicators. Some about that, some were about indicators of governance that are favored by academics, such as my colleague Professor Lucian Bebchuk, shareholder empowerment measures, such what the directors thought about that, and then some other things that we stuck in there. Interesting, clear pattern emerged from this. As a group, actual directors didn't really place a super high value on the ISS type factors, other than the ones that are mandated by law, not surprisingly. But things like whether you separate the chairman and CEO positions, whether you have a super majority of independent directors rather than just a bare majority, whether you have substantial director stock ownership requirements, things that would all point towards making directors more independent and more aligned with shareholders, and therefore better able to stand up to management and police them and monitor them and see when they were doing bad things. The directors as a group put those in the bottom half of the pile. Even more lowly rated were the indicators of shareholder empowerment, whether you did not have a poison pill plan in place, whether you had annual elections of all directors, whether you had an easy ability of shareholders to mandate bylaw changes, all that sort of stuff that some professors have lots of empirical evidence really matters. Well, the directors didn't think so. What did they value highly? Turns out they valued people and process. The highest scoring items were, well, what's really important are these fuzzy things like what's the actual composition of your board, the quality of the people, the balance of talents and how they work together on the one hand, and second, the process. Do you have good agenda setting, adequate time for the most important topics, advanced materials, et cetera, et cetera. Pursuing that, we didn't do enough in the survey. We came up with a conclusion that most directors really think in their heart of hearts that the most important thing they could do as a board is two things. One, push the company to adopt a sensible long-term business strategy. That would be a whole other session why they think that doesn't happen as well as it should. And second, our topic today, get involved in, push for, and ensure good succession planning and CEO selection. Everyone thought that was right up there as an important thing. How well do we do it? Well, most people sort of acknowledge that we're not optimal. And I'll give you my view, which is this. I think on the scale of things that boards do, you can classify a lot of them under the category of participating generically in management, hearing about the business plans, the results, et cetera, the strategy, the CEO succession on the one hand, monitoring on the other hand, making sure that the CEOs are telling the truth to the market and to the board, and that they're not making decisions based on their own personal interests, fiduciary duties and all that stuff. My view is that either the most important or one of the two most important roles of boards are to participate in CEO selection and succession planning. And I also think unfortunately, that's one of the roles, succession planning, that's least optimally done in the modern world by the modern type boards. So by comparison, let me say a little bit about this. Why is this happening? I think the board's monitoring role in a post-Sarbanes-Oxley world, and especially after lots and lots of Delaware case law development, is pretty important, but it actually gets carried out reasonably well in a lot of companies. Not always, obviously. We wouldn't have litigation, we wouldn't have courses to teach. And I would make a similar point about the kinds of things that boards do in dealing with major business transactions, like approving or disapproving a merger, responding to a takeover threat, or a major regulatory inquiry or a shareholder lawsuit. But I think boards could add a lot of value to succession planning if they did it right, but they don't. And I'll just give you my indication, I'll see what the other panelists think, of why I think it's suboptimal in the current world. I think CEO selection is suboptimal simply because it's extremely difficult. It's hard to know who's going to be really good. The insiders have superior knowledge but bias of various sorts. The outside independent directors don't have as much knowledge, even if they have good incentives, and it's very hard to predict the future. We'll hear more about that when Janet takes over her part. The succession planning part, which I think is incredibly important to how well CEO selection eventually is, tends to get systemically neglected until it's too late to be done really well. Why? I'll give you my little quickie analysis. I think that it's because of incentives and practices on both the board side and the CEO side. CEO side is a little easy. I think the typical CEO is a little concerned about developing the bench strength and the talent and identifying to the independent directors who the next good CEO from inside the company or outside would be. Why? I think because at some level in their heart of hearts, he or she, the CEO, is saying something like, well, I'm not sure I know when I really want to retire or move on from this job. Also, I don't want the board to think that anybody else is ready and able to do this job as well as I'm doing it. Because, I don't want the board to get some ideas about replacing me if the company should hit a speed bump of some sort, which does happen from time to time. And I also want them to pay me as much as possible on the assumption that I'm uniquely valuable, not just really valuable, but uniquely valuable. So I think there's some psychological incentive on the part of CEOs not to want to do this. And furthermore, they're busy. Now, on the board side, what's the problem? At least three things. Well, more generally, the problem is agenda crowding, crowding out of paying attention at the proper time to succession planning. Why does it happen? Three things. One is so much time, especially post Sarbanes-Oxley and new listing standards, is spent on compliance and monitoring. I think most of us directors would say, who have been around a long time, that the amount of time spent on board functions is much, much greater now than it was, say, in the early 90s or in the late 80s when I started being a director. It's an enormous increase, and so much of it is due to things that could fall under the category of compliance, such as audit committee work being twice what it used to be, or more recently, compensation committee work on CD&A analysis and disclosure, which also has a compliance focus. So there's crowding out from that. The second reason that the succession planning tends to get crowded out is that there's always some urgent hot issue that seems more interesting and pressing and important. So it might be something like a takeover possibility, an acquisition or divestiture plan, a sex scandal involving a division head, or God forbid, one of the people in the top CEO suite, or a big shareholder litigation that has gone to a point where you might want to settle it. there's always something that can lead the CEO and the board to say, well, we'll have to put off that discussion or review of who are the best candidates for CEO succession because we have this other thing. And finally, the third thing that crowds the agenda is just what I would call the ritualistic stuff. I think boards of directors, just like groups of people everywhere, do like to engage in things that have a definite formatted structure because they, like religious rituals, they indirectly alleviate anxiety and dread. Now, what am I talking about? Reviewing the financial statements. So boards and committees spend a puzzlingly long amount of time, in my experience, looking at the quarterly results, the cash flow, the EBITDA, the earnings, and how they compare to plan and year to date, and how they're going to be for the rest of the year, and how it varies from the analyst consensus, up or down a little bit. You go through all that and you feel, we did something. It's definite. Whereas talking about who would be a good CEO successor and how do we plan for this and give them a chance to grow and show themselves, that's sort of open-ended and vague. Might be important, but we don't really think so. So I think for all these reasons, the topic tends to get neglected, even though I think it's probably the area in which independent boards could, when they do it well, add the most shareholder value in the long term. So I'll stop with that. I'll leave the question, well, what to do about all this. We'll get into that in some of the other parts of this.
Right, and what we're going to do now is we're going to hear from each of our panelists for a couple, I'd ask them to just keep it to a couple minutes of sort of opening thoughts, because then the game plan is we're going to go through a little bit of the life cycle of this. Janet's going to talk about hiring a CEO on a clear day, and we're going to talk about succession planning, and then we're going to end up with crisis replacement. So I want to, Susan, why don't we start with you and then go to Janet and Charles for just some opening thoughts you'd like the audience to keep in mind, and then we'll go to Janet for the...
disagree. But
well, maybe I'll just respond to some of your thoughts and contrast it to my own experience. I'm probably very Pollyannish, but I believe that CEOs should, and at least in my experience, have the interest of the shareholders at mind, not their own personal aggrandizement or ego satisfaction. So if that's the case, they ought to be worrying about optimizing shareholder return and ensuring that the person at the helm is capable of doing that. So I understand the way people are and would contrast them to the way people should be, and in which case one of their foremost thoughts should be who's going to replace him or her and what the profile of that person should be. So maybe as it should be, maybe as a contrast to what it is. In terms of the crowding out, clearly agendas are very crowded, but in my experience as a board, when we filled our CEO for the 2 years prior to that, which was really my start on the board, every single meeting we talked about succession planning. It was a very important subject, and we changed the view and we used an outside consultant as well, but we changed the view of the potential candidates through that period of time because one of the internal candidates actually, during that period of time, turned out not to be a viable candidate. So it really is a question of setting priorities on that agenda and making sure that it is on the agenda every time. And dividing and conquering around using committees, so you have in our case, the governance and the compensation committee does that work, and the audit and the finance committee does the other work. So if you divide and conquer, then you don't have the whole board looking over financial statements. You have the audit committee or the finance committee doing that, and the rest of the board relies on that for answering questions. So it really is setting priorities and dividing and conquering to make sure that succession planning is a critical process.
Well, thank you. First of all, I agree with both Robert and Susan. I would add one other thing to your list, Robert. I think we're still in a transition, if you will, from CEO-run boards, if you will, to independent directors running boards. So that transition is still going on, and so some of the things that you're ideally setting out just don't happen just yet. I'm supposed to talk about CEO selection in a non-crisis situation. I have a couple of thoughts here. I think it's one of the most important responsibilities of a board, and the others are evaluation of the CEO's performance and succession planning. So those are the three most important things that as an independent director, I've been on 8 boards in 18 years. I serve now on 3 boards. Most of those companies have been sold. Normally, a CEO search, and this is in a non-crisis situation, in my estimation or my experience, has been conducted by the entire board as a committee of the whole. However, I've also experienced the idea of a selection committee or a board committee put together, an ad hoc committee, in order to conduct a search. I've seen that work well, and I've seen it not work well. I was once, years ago, on a board where such a process took place, and the leader of that special committee actually asked the rest of us to cede our proxy to the committee to make a final decision among candidates that were not revealed to us. I spoke up right away and said, under those circumstances, I will vote no for that candidate, whomever he or she is, because if I'm not permitted to meet him or her, I'm not going to vote for him or her, and please put it in the proxy. Well, that broke the wall of secrecy around that selection committee, and once that veil was pierced, the process opened up, successfully, I might say. Obviously, we as board members use advisors, and that's been mentioned before, perhaps some are in the room now, to help us propose candidates. That works well too, but sometimes a problem occurs in the instruction that's given to a search consultant. If they're told to find a candidate, for example, who has 10 or more years of experience as a CEO, but not told to seek candidates that are CFOs and members of management, top management, clearly CEO material, but not quite there yet, then we tend to sometimes get a recycled list over and over again. The system can appear to propose the same names over and over again, and that's very frustrating. A more sticky situation, and I've been in this situation before, is when some members of the board of directors, and I'm speaking of the independent members, want a certain type of CEO, and other board members want someone with entirely different skills. Another often difficult situation arises when the board is composed itself of mostly CEOs and retired CEOs. I'm not a CEO. I'm not a retired CEO. So I've been in that situation, if you will, and sometimes it's fraught with a certain amount of difficulty inside the boardroom. It's always a regrettable situation when there are no internal candidates for CEO. Essentially, it's a signal that the board failed in its duty to require the CEO to develop internal candidates, as has already been described, for an unexpected or expected change at the top. The CEO failed too, obviously, in those circumstances. In the end, the CEO or the selection of a CEO is a leap of faith. Not unlike every employment decision, it is impossible to know if she or he will demonstrate the necessary, if not superior, leadership skills we always seek. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to Charles, and Charles is going to give his overall thoughts, and then we're going to focus for a while on this hiring a CEO on a clear day. How do you do it? What's the structure? Who are your advisors? So, Charles, you can kick us off on some general thoughts, and then go right into your thoughts on that segment of it.
Sure. First of all, I think that I've been on 6 boards. I've been through 4 awkward CEO successions. 3 were board-driven, 1 was CEO-driven. So, I've kind of seen the waterfront on that one. And the conclusion that I draw out of all of them, and frankly, board service generally, is the board's responsibility is pretty straightforward. We're there to hire and fire the CEO, bottom line, and monitor the CEO in between those 2 points. And so succession planning is naturally critical to the board's mission. I mean, the board CEO runs the company. The board is there to monitor the CEO and convince itself that the CEO is running the company effectively. And if they don't believe that's happening, then it's time to replace the CEO with someone else. And that's what succession is all about. Who do you get in? Either a replacement of the CEO because of a forced event, or a death, or replacement of a CEO because they retire, and that happens too, obviously. But the key is either process, replacement of a CEO on a regular basis, a la a retirement, or an emergency replacement of the CEO, are actually both quite different. The plan process can go on for a while. And it's typically, well, traditionally, it was CEO-driven. I think it's a process that, frankly, should be board-driven instead. Typically, when a CEO is retiring, there'll be the picking of the heir apparent, but traditionally, that has been something the CEO does, and the board basically backs up the CEO. I'm one of these folks who disagrees with that and thinks it really ought to be clearly board-driven from beginning to end, with CEO input, but board-driven. The other kind of succession is not board-driven. I mean, it's not CEO-driven. Obviously, it's where someone is fired or dies or leaves on the quick. And by its very nature, that's something that the CEO has nothing to do with, because either they're dead or gone or fired. And that's the board process. And where succession planning is important there is not on the board operating the process, but the board insisting that when that occurs, that the board have in mind someone to bring in to replace the CEO, either on an interim basis, in an emergency, or a permanent basis. And that's where it gets dicey. And that's going to be, I think, the topic I've been asked to take. But I think critically to think about, the board's obligation as a board is to manage that process, whether on a regular basis or on an emergency basis. And I think we get into trouble when, in fact, the CEO or the board cedes to the CEO that critical part of their obligation. So with that in mind...
well, and let's kick it over to Janet, and this is the part where we're going to talk about, assume it's just a typical, it's not a crisis, it's not necessarily ideal, there's no obvious successor, you've got some time horizon to pick the new CEO, and what we want to get into, Janet, and you lead this office, how do you go about doing that? What are the ways the board organizes itself? Who are its advisors? How do you go about the inside-outside look?
Well, in my experience, the board takes a lead in this, the independent members of the board, without those who are insiders or conflicted, because I'm on boards where there are individuals who are not independent, but they're also not in management. In other words, they may do business with the company or something of that sort. So the independent directors take the lead. Typically, they hire a search firm, if you will, and that search firm will help to generate names. If the CEO has passed away or is leaving imminently, then there is an internal person who is put in charge. Sometimes it's a board member, by the way, who is put in as the acting CEO. This is public information. We just had an acting CEO at Sprint when we made a change. We fired our CEO. And we put the CFO in as the acting CEO until we could conduct a search. We considered him along with other internal candidates and external candidates, and selected an external candidate.
Well, for this part, let's focus on, say your CEO has done the responsible thing, saying, I'm gonna leave in a year. Mm-hmm. I think, here's my bench, but we've worked on the bench. It's not obvious. You should look at them. You've got some time.
Well,
how do you do that process?
I'm a person who believes that we should look at both internal and external candidates, because even if we have a strong internal candidate, looking at a few external candidates will reinforce that. So I would be in favor of looking at both.
I agree with that. I mean, at the end of the last calendar year, we at Time Warner chose a new CEO. I was heavily involved in that process because I'm chair of the Nom and Gov committee, and that was the committee that was assigned the task of doing the search. We actually started perhaps a year and a half earlier than that. We knew the timeline of our CEO. He's a person with no psychological problems whatsoever. He knew when he wanted to retire, and he stayed with it, and he's politically very skilled, Dick Parsons, and so he was easy to deal with. The process had a number of steps. We first decided in the committee and then in the board in executive sessions to get some statement of what we were looking for in a new CEO. We also had our ideas about who in the company was a likely prospect.
Bob, how did you get the ideas on who inside the company? Where did that come from?
These were people we had been exposed to at numerous board meetings and strategic retreats, and we had heard about. I mean, that goes more to the bench. The bench building was very good at this company, actually. It's not always that way.
But that's not coming from the CEO so much as from the independent.
Oh, no. A lot of this was actual interactions with them. People have their own views.
Yes.
So we hired a search. We tried to work up some criteria. The most important things for Time Warner with its current crises and strategy, the long-term problems. And then hired an outside search firm, and a fellow came in and he tried to have us structure our list of characteristics. This was almost funny because there was a list of maybe 100 different characteristics under various categories that we all had to rate, what we thought was most important in the next CEO. We did it independently, the whole board. Then he aggregated the data, had lots of little charts, and we discussed this, and lots of the older directors, of course, made fun of it, said this is ridiculous. But it did have the useful purpose of forcing us to think about things like how important is communicating to the analyst community or to the market, how important is motivation, political skills, how important is technical knowledge, understanding the new digital world versus just being a general manager, how important is real smarts, then how important is integrity, and everybody says number 5 out of a scale of 1 to 5 on that one. And then we would look at, different people had different valuations of the characteristics, and that was a useful discussion. The next stage of the process was to get ratings of internal people by committee and board member. The board sort of took this over after a while, of all of the internal people who had been exposed to, as well as ratings of outsiders that we use for benchmark. This is your point. We felt it was extremely important to look at people at other big media companies who might, at least in theory, be potential lateral hires. Even though in some cases that was a little unrealistic. We got ratings by the search firm of them in inquiries, as well as the committee interviewed people at Time Warner who had actually worked with some of those people at other media companies. So we got lots of information.
Yeah,
and at
Bob,
the end
would
of
you-
the day, we sort of knew who we wanted, and it was a beautiful transition.
Well, and I think that's interesting, and I'd like the other panelists to comment on that dynamic with the inside-outside, which is you obviously selected someone, and it was a very orderly transition.
Yeah.
Outside candidates might well have had a sense that that was the way it was going to go down. And as a practical matter, how do you deal with, how real is it possible, and how are the evaluation of these outsiders, how is that different? Are the outside advisors more important than that as opposed to your own perception?
Right. I think we were sort of depending on the evaluations collected from many sources by the search firm, as well as by the sort of double checks of 3 or 4 people who we trusted inside the company who had actually known these people.
Did you
so
have the
that was limited. Now, we didn't actually go and interview any of these people
That was
because
gonna be my question. Did you
that would be
actually-
too tricky.
Yeah, okay.
Just whereas in the other search I'm doing, this very moment, in fact, a few minutes before this session, I got a call about it. The TIA search, we were looking at insiders and outsiders for real in both cases. We have done intensive interviews of all of the outside candidates. And when I say intensive, I mean like 3 2-hour interviews with the committee, and then dinner meetings with the finalists and each individual person. Well, I've spent so much of my life on this recently, it's unbelievable.
Jenna or Charles or anybody about your experiences of this inside-outside balance and how easy or hard it is to get outsiders to get real in a process if there's a serious inside candidate?
Well, again, it's board driven, and the board has to decide, I think, where what is necessary in an organization. There's sometimes that it's better to go inside, sometimes it's better to go outside. Depends on the health of the organization and what you want to see happening. I was involved in one organization that we went outside because we had a good bench inside, but we believed the thing needed to be shaken up a little bit. And someone from the outside could bring objectivity and perspective and sort of rattle some old parts of the culture that probably needed to be rattled. And that's why we went outside. There's another situation, we went inside because we felt that the culture didn't need to be rattled, but instead the culture needed to be supported. And it's completely situational. But I go back to the same theme. I think when, you look at business school studies of CEO succession, and they always talk about, the danger of the horse race. And there always was the view that it was the CEO picking the successor, and the board's role was really ancillary. And I think what you've seen in governance today, and this goes back to an NACD report, this is back, I think, 2000, on CEO succession in 1998, and the view was that the process really has to be dominated by the board, run by the board. The CEO's input is important. Obviously,
Right.
that person knows who's out there and certainly knows the bench and has run the company. On the other hand, that's really not up to, and the CEO is a director in most cases and has a vote. But the process really needs to be run by the board because that's the board's responsibility. And the board, I think, has the objectivity, I would hope, to evaluate appropriately inside or outside and make the right decisions.
I mean, I definitely think that the board obviously has to make the selection, but I think we need to hold the CEO accountable for making sure that there is a rich succession, a rich bench from internal candidates. The CEO has to choose those candidates, has to develop those candidates, has to bring them before the board, has to share with the board what the developmental needs are so the board can see those develop over time or not. So I think it's really the CEO's responsibility to make sure there is a rich choice for the board to make. It's going to be the board's choice, but they need to make sure that there's sufficient and adequate and excellent candidates internally to be able to make that selection. I also think that
I
there
agree
should
with
be an
both
external,
points.
there should always be an external.
Have any of you been in,
priorities.
I guess, if you're in a situation where there were two very credible potential successors, they're both very important to the operation of the company. They know you're looking at outside candidates. They know that it's not clear either one of them. How do you get the organization to function during that? Is it debilitating at all? Does it, it's got to be distracting for those two people. This is sort of their life's goal at stake, right?
That's the danger of the horse race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
You also have to worry about, well, if we don't take one of these internal people who has been interviewed a few times, will they walk, and how big of a problem is that going to be?
If you pick between two, they always do walk. I mean, it's rare that they'll stay. Of course they. I mean, look at Leonard Dell. You know, General Electric was a classic where they all walk. But anytime you're going to pick between two, key is you don't want to let the process drag on and on, so you get a fight within the organization itself. It needs to take place effectively, and I think relatively quickly.
And the criteria needs to be very transparent, and the feedback needs to be there. So it's very clear why one is ahead of the other, or what one needs to do to catch up to the other.
In a non-crisis situation, what do you consider a reasonable amount of time to do a search
Me,
and make a decision?
I
I'm
would
just
say
curious.
a couple of months, maybe a little less than a couple of months. You know, maybe 2-3 months. I mean, anytime you get longer than that, the organization gets into
It is
a crisis.
disruptive otherwise, yeah.
How good are these advisors to you, Janet and Charles and everybody? Because 2 months, that seems, if you're going to look outside at all, it sounds like I mean, unless you know, if you got people on the board who really know other folks, you're going to have some pretty high quality advice, right?
Use a search firm. So, I mean, that's what search firms are for. Some are better than others.
Right, comp consultants or comp departments.
No,
We
I
have a search
agree.
firm person here.
What are they for?
I
But-
agree. I agree. I don't do search myself, but I must say that I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I won't name them. And so, yes, I agree that we have to have quality assistance, if you will. And again, that's even in vetting the internal candidate. It's
Right.
good to have an external
Yes.
force. But search firms don't have a fiduciary responsibility for the company. So please remember that. They are consultants. I am a consultant. They are external, if you will, and their advice is to be heeded, but it is not controlling, if you will. So I think the board members have to remember that.
How have the independence standards played into this? And let me one of the things we've talked about a lot in the class is who's on boards. And although there's problems with gray directors, I could imagine a board 20 years ago potentially having some gray directors with some serious industry affiliations where they may know more executives themselves from other firms in the industry. Whereas today, a lot of those affiliations would not have you on that board. Are the independent directors themselves in as good a position to be resources about outside candidates as they used to be?
I don't know that they used to be. I'll take a little issue with that, and I'll use an example. I went on the Wendy's board 18 years ago, or 16 years ago, and Dave Thomas brought me on the board because I sat next to him at the Fuqua School of Business board. And we got to chatting at each one of the board member meetings, and he thought I would be a good member of the Wendy's board. Well, it turns out most of the members of the Wendy's board were friends of his. And nice guys, many of them quite elderly, and they began to leave the board, and the board became more independent, and I think reflected what became the rule, if you will, after Enron and WorldCom, et cetera. But the board meetings themselves only lasted maybe 45 minutes. The comp committee was, I think, 15.
Was
This
he
is
on?
18 years ago.
Was he on?
Yeah, that's a while ago.
He was on the comp?
I think he was on every committee, and he was a very avuncular. He's a wonderful man, by the way. But it was not at all the structure we have today at Wendy's, which is extremely well put together company, and the meetings are much longer. So let me say that. There's a lot more responsibility, if you will, that falls on those of us who are independent board members and those who are not.
The point is that, whether they were great directors or independent directors, picking a successor is a crapshoot. I mean, whether you do it inside, whether you inside or outside, you never know how someone's going to turn out. I mean, there have been people that I kind of thought, gee, I wonder how they're going to really work out. Who've turned out brilliantly, and others that came in, I thought they're going to be fantastic, and who ended up being a dog. I mean, the individual, it's individual to the individual, and I think regardless of who picks them, you're going to run into those issues.
Do you ever, as part of success, and we're going to get into succession planning, but in terms of this clear day, do you ever come into this with such a good succession plan where you've actually been thinking about outsiders along the way?
Yes, sure. Companies do that, and they should.
Yeah, all the time. But
Sometimes you even think about hiring somebody away so that they have a few years with you before the time comes for a new CEO selection.
Bob, going back to the question of the internal candidates, are the internal candidates pretty much fed to you by the CEO, or to what extent does the board have the ability to reach beyond the people that the CEO may want you to meet?
Well, that flips into that third topic we were going to get to, which is succession planning. I think boards can and should, as Susan was saying, make it an objective of the CEO to train the bench and supply it and do assessments and report to the board and all that regularly about who might inside the company be a good successor. In fact, that ought to be part of the compensation scorecard.
But you wouldn't
we
reach
do that. But the board itself will actually can and should go beyond that and push the CEO and say, why aren't you talking about X? Seems to us X, the lawyer who has done all this M&A work, is so much smarter than the other ones, and why wouldn't he or she be a good manager if rotated into some more hands-on role, et cetera, et cetera. So that sort of thing can be done, and I think that's my main point is boards have to be proactive on this and really push for it and say we want it as part of the CEO's objectives. We want regular reports. We want to hear reports and updates, his opinion or hers. And then we want to have our own executive sessions where we say, well, what did we think of that? Why is it so-and-so being considered? And shouldn't we push for that?
well, your head of
One
HR too is helpful.
I was only going to add that one of the problems that I've seen on boards is when a board or when the independent members of the board are receiving all of their information from the CEO.
Right.
So they have no contact with other members of senior management and cannot make an independent judgment, as you are suggesting, that the chief counsel or the chief marketing director or the CFO is someone who might be able to run this company. I think that's a bad situation.
Absolutely.
And I am a board member who knows many people within, many members of management, almost all members of management, within every company on whose board I serve, which is another reason that is a little time consuming and burdensome even, to use that term, to serve on these boards, because that takes time. But I do not get all of my information from the CEO. Now, I have had CEOs who don't like that statement and don't like independent director Janet Hill, who actually would pick up the phone and call the treasurer and ask him or her a question, or of course the head of HR or the chief marketing director, etc. So
Good. I have, for myself, developed a little checklist of 7 ways to make sure you get information about the internal candidates. And it's useful to me just to, in each of the boards I've been on, to think about which of these we're doing and then to try to nag people to do them. One is obviously to get the CEO's assessments of who he or she thinks are the good successors and make sure they're updated frequently. But a second is to have a board or committee review of 360 evaluations. So a lot of companies have these evaluations of division heads and top functional officers by the other employees, and you know, we have a right to see this stuff. And at TIA, for example, we do that. You know, I look at the 360s on the top 20 people in the company, and so do a lot of the other trustees. A third way is to make sure that the people who are likely successors get to give significant presentations to the board of a general sort, not just, you know, show quick latest results, but here's the my division or my function, what's it's all about, and the challenges and opportunities and what and so forth. And then a fourth point is to have informal dinner meetings with those people, usually after they've done a presentation, so you can get a sense of them as people. A fifth thing to do is, this is hard, but to have on-site visits to their offices and divisions. If it's a division head, you want to go and look. I mean, I'm on the board of Omnicom Group, big giant advertising agency, holding company, marketing. That's fun, it turns out, you know, to go to the headquarters of one of the main chunks of the enterprise and see what all of the creative types are doing and get a sense of who's really managing well. A sixth thing is to have is to make sure that the serious internal candidates give long presentations at your annual strategy retreat. You know, check out their big think skills, assuming you have a strategy retreat, and it really is long term, which a lot of companies don't do right. And then finally, intensive interviews by the relevant committee of people, you know, which you don't always have to say, this is because we're considering you as a potential successor.
Well, I think this is a gateway, because it's interesting, it's hard to separate these topics, right? We try to do it in a life cycle, and we're going to get into succession planning. I want to ask one final question about the selecting the CEO on the clear day that's going to bridge into this succession and what Bob was just talking about, which is structure. When you select the CEO on the clear day, is there a special committee of the board appointed, or is there a particular sitting committee of the board that tends to take the lead on this, like the comp committee? And how does the committee check back in with the full board? Because obviously, Bob, not everybody on TIA is spending all time in 2-hour meetings with candidates. I would hope not.
No.
And so you've got to consult, obviously, with the full board. How does that typically, in the form of your experience, how does that work?
Seems to vary. I had in the past have been on boards where the controlling shares were held by an investment banking fund, and I guess those guys are the ones who ran the process. But at Time Warner was the Nom and Gov committee did the selection part, and HR or comp committee worked out the compensation deal, and in effect the whole board actually made the decision.
So nominating and compensation found them, and nominating and governance found them, and comp hired them.
Formally put it forward, but that was the board that had a lot of veterans who had their own strong opinions, so it was actually done by the whole board. TIAA-CREF right now is complicated. We have a special ad hoc search committee because you know, some of you are professors here or university, you may have your money with them. There's two entities plus a board of overseers that holds the stock and doesn't take it. So we actually have a couple of representatives from each. That's how I'm on it, and that search committee is clearly doing all the heavy lifting, but the TIAA board, not the other two, are the ones that have to make the decision when we make a recommendation. And then we'll have an HR committee meeting to go over the compensation arrangement for the finalists.
Anyone else in terms of what committees do this work? Or
We don't have that many committees, but it was really the governance and the compensation committee who would do the heavy lifting with the consultant and identify the candidates. But everyone on the board was encouraged to have 2-on-1 interviews. So two of us would get together, and they would set up the interviews anywhere that we needed to have those, which I thought was a good idea.
And my experience has been either the governance committee or an ad hoc committee that's been put together for this special purpose, if you will. But then the final decision is made by the entire board.
Charles?
It varies. I mean, one board, we had a special committee appointed to work on succession. Another that it was in the comp committee.
Well, I'm talking right now about retention in the non-crisis. When you go out,
right.
You're looking
right.
inside out.
That's right.
Who's the lead committee?
It was a special committee we established.
Right. I guess background question, when we all talked about committees, are they almost always made up solely of independent directors now in the last few years? That's my experience.
The boards I'm on, all the committees are made up of independent directors. There are no internal directors or any who are conflicted in any way.
Ed, did you want to? Does the general counsel play any role in this?
No. Well, in the contract, sure. I mean, if it comes.
Well, in succession planning on our third day, trying to see if the lawyers are inside or outside lawyers have any role in this process.
I haven't had lawyers playing a role in succession planning itself. Now, obviously, in the business of hiring a CEO, there is the contract, if you will, and so our general counsel has been involved in each of these companies.
May have an outside counsel advising the search group about when you're getting close to having a deal that's going to be put to the board, to see if there's any problems either with the compensation contract, do a Disney litigation review of the contract is the way I think about it, or also a review of potential conflicts of interest if the new CEO has is an outsider with some other business arrangements. You want to scrub all that. And then just mainly to make sure that we follow all the process steps. So I think it's probably a good idea as you get close to the end to have an independent outside counsel. That's what we're doing at TIAA. Using the inside counsel is a little tricky if you have inside candidates because word can get around how it's going, and you don't want that. I think it would be probably a good idea if more boards did that, had an experienced lawyer come in and say, you better think about the steps here.
Well, let's get into the succession because I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and our students have certainly been thinking about it. Let's assume you've got this CEO and board. How do you? And we could spend the whole time obviously on the initial compensation contract, but let's assume we got the person a while. What is your structure? How are you going to go about monitoring this person, making sure that you keep the compensation system in alignment? And do the board committees that are supposed to be monitoring performance and those that do compensation, are they the same? And if they're not, how does the structure work? And all the things you've talked about in terms of how do you develop a bench strength and make sure that if the person doesn't know how to follow the walk sign, that you've got somebody to step into place, and all that good stuff we call succession planning. How's
My
that work?
experience is that succession planning is handled by the governance committee. However, the full review of the CEO's performance for the year is done to the board and by the board, and I mean by the independent members of the board.
Well, why the heck, I'll be provocative, why the heck is governance handling this separately from the compensation committee? That seems to be asinine,
No.
to use the technical term.
No. Actually, you have both.
Street vernacular.
I think it's once a year you want your CEO to sit down with a committee, usually governance, and say, here are my main objectives for the next year, in sort of plain English, and talk about them, and write them down in a memo, and you discuss them and debate them. They're also given to the comp committee that might use them to adjust some scorecard measure that relates to the compensation. Then you compare them. But you have two committees with two different levels of generality reviewing these things.
But why, pray tell, wouldn't you design a compensation structure for the top managers of the company that fit in with your strategic goals
You do
and then
try
have
to
an
do that. It's
integrated
just that
review.
the strategic goals are sometimes hard to, translate into very specific measures. And you want a more general discussion as well as the one that's all about the money,
But why would you use two separate committees for that?
because you get different perspectives. That's why, and sometimes it makes a difference. The comp committee is usually obsessed with things like, well, how does it compare to other CEOs in the industry? How does it compare to other people in the company, et cetera? And a Nom and Gov committee can say, well, don't you think your main focus ought to be on turning around this division or branching out in that?
Well, I'd love to hear from the four of you whether you think that separation makes you stronger,
It's not.
or isn't, or
temporary.
actually is a manager's dream.
No. You bring it together in the executive sessions, where everyone hears the reports from both committees.
Plus, in the evaluation process, at least in the boards I'm on, we have a chance to evaluate each one of us in writing, filling out a form, our CEO at the end of the year. We also evaluate the board as a whole, and we evaluate those members who are up for re-election each year, because that's part of the determination as to whether we'll put them up for re-election. And in the case of Sprint, all of us are up for re-election every year. So there's an evaluation of each one of us
And
every year.
do you keep those written evaluation forms?
No, there's something called Survey Monkey, is that what it's called? That apparently is very secure, and that's what at least one of the boards uses. But I do mine online, so I'm sorry, I don't know where it goes into the online.
I think we have a question.
I had a similar question. If for compensation you had a peer group of 7 or 8 people, wouldn't those be the natural people you'd be looking at as potential replacement for your CEOs? So wouldn't you want to sort of build those things together a little closer?
Not really, because if they are in competing companies, if you will, then they're not going to leave McDonald's and come to Wendy's. They're not going to leave Panera Bread and come to Wendy's.
I think, Janet, I think the question is if the comp committee itself has purview over a certain tier of the executive corps. These are your internal candidates. And they're setting the compensation incentives for that. Isn't that a natural way to look at their natural group to be focused on their performance as well and give you a natural way of doing the 360 reviews? And I guess I would ask Bob, in terms of challenging you all to think about this, within the corporation for managers, when they're actually getting compensated at lower levels, are the compensation decisions made for them in terms of their bonuses and all really separate from the review process done for their performance?
No.
And if it's not done that way within ordinary executive structures, why is the bifurcation by the board a sensible approach to this?
Well, I will repeat what I was trying to communicate. I think it's useful to have a more general discussion of goals and priorities as opposed to, okay, now here's how we implement them in measures, and here's how we discuss performance and achievement. It's too easy to get caught up in the details, I think, and never to revisit the fundamental questions about where the emphasis ought to be. Maybe this is just something a board could do. But on your question about comparing CEO's performance with just a peer group that's relevant to the compensation group, it sometimes doesn't, that's not always the group you're going to look at for a CEO successor. I think Janet is absolutely right. I'm thinking very vividly right now of the TIAA-CREF situation. Where would you look for a potential outsider? Fidelity or Vanguard, the main competitors on campus? Well, not really. So what do you do after that? Well, maybe you look at other financial services firms more broadly, even though they don't really compete, because it's probably desirable to have someone with experience in the financial world more broadly. And also in that case, we are a nonprofit that has a charter mission to serve higher ed and other nonprofit organizations. So you want somebody who has a strong affinity for the nonprofit world. Well, that opens up a whole other set of possible candidates who may be lacking on some of the financial services dimension. So it can get very complicated. Who you look for is not necessarily, it's not going to be the same group you necessarily look at when you're deciding compensation.
And I just would ask everybody, is it the case, Charles? I mean, is it this structure that comp focus more particularly on the contracts, whereas nominating and governance does the bigger picture overview? Is that your typical experience as well?
Look, I mean, the nominating governance committees I'm on aren't involved in that. I mean, we typically see the compensation committees are the ones that review the compensation and performance as it relates to compensation and shares that with the full board, who then does an overall evaluation of the CEO. I mean, the CEO isn't re-engaged every year. I mean, typically, if you have a contract every 3 years, but on an annual basis, the board does discuss, particularly in the executive session, how the CEO is performing. And certainly, what's regarding the comp committee has got to be reported to the full board because they've got to vote on the pay. I mean, it's, the problem is, I hate to use the term one size doesn't fit all because I hate that term, but one size really doesn't fit all. I mean, it depends on the politics of the board, how large it is, how small it is, the industry you're in. You can't, unfortunately, you can't design a common metric. Each board has its own way of doing things.
Well, let me ask this too. Is there an express decision by the board to delegate to a committee primary responsibility for succession planning?
They
and
never
how
do.
You get, well,
they can't, they shouldn't.
Then how does it get on the agenda, and how do you go about
It's
doing
part
it?
of the, typically succession planning, the boards I'm involved in, have been involved in, are a regular part of the agenda. You would typically have it at a particular meeting each year, maybe 2 meetings a year, but it's a part of the agenda item that you factor in. We just had a board meeting and came back and we had a good 3-hour succession planning slug built into that meeting. We typically do that every year. It's part of the regular process. There's no committee because that's the board's responsibility. You shouldn't be able to delegate hiring or replacing a CEO to a committee. It really needs to be done by the full board.
That was the point I made earlier. 5 of the 6 meetings a year, succession planning is on the agenda, just as a normal course of discussion.
And do every one of your boards, do you have an emergency, the CEO crossed the street wrong plan?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
We say if the CEO gets hit by a beer truck, we've got that plan.
Or ate too many Baconators.
Or an asteroid, maybe?
Don't say that.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has that in mind. Unfortunately, though, you may have that in mind, but the reality of it, when that, in fact, the situation occurs, may be very different from the emergency plan, and it never plays out the way you think it's going to play out.
And the emergency succession plan is acknowledged to be a temporary solution. It's just until the board gets together and decides, well, now let's do a search or a selection.
Bob, you mentioned, I think this is an important topic, about how the day-to-day way that you approach your board thing gives you access to people within the corporation. And how do you all use these new executive what are the executive sessions that you have with outside management? Do you talk about how you structure your board committees in terms of the reporting roles of various officers so that you're each getting sort of multiple points of access that give you that chance to see managers outside the CEO's sort of direct supervision? Yes,
I think that's been one of the very good things about executive sessions is that people will bring up ideas like that and say, we ought to have more of these informal after the board dinner meetings so that we can get to know some of these division people better. Have 1 or 2 at each time, or maybe have dinner meetings with them just to hear about their division or their function. Every now, I think that's very valuable, and that's the kind of thing that tends to come up in the executive session, not an idea from the CEO.
We also have frequently suggestions that we have meetings someplace other than at corporate headquarters, so we can see some of the divisions of the company and some of the facilities of the company, also meeting other, usually in that case, managers who are heading up an area of the company.
You always want to get exposed as a director as best you can to talent within the organization, and that's typically why you'll have a board dinner and they'll bring the senior management team or some folks slightly below senior management team to meet once in a while, so you get to know them. On the other hand, you got to be a little ginger on how you deal with them because calling them up unannounced scares the dickens out of them. And frankly, probably gets your CEO angry, and that's a tough. I mean, you have to be ginger about it. And that's, but again, you probably, it's best to get to know as many people in the organization as you can in the event something happens, that you have some people in mind that you've met and have some confidence in. But again, you don't know how they're going to play out until it actually happens. There's no great way. I mean, I wish you could say, we'll run a metric and they'll
That's probably
predict
the
it.
biggest systemic problem, right, of CEO selection. You you really can't predict, because you can look for, say, an outsider who's in a comparable industry position, and you run the risk that, okay, they seem to have had a great track record there, but if they're actually the CEO of another company, it's very hard to move them.
Right.
That rarely happens. They have to be a smaller company, or they have to be second in lines at some other company. And then you don't know whether, the big risk is, will they get your internal culture and people in specific? There's a lot of embedded particular knowledge about every company, and the outsider may not get it.
And the superstar typically flames
You know,
out.
right, and the superstar flames out. It's the search for the savior, who turns out to be a disaster.
Well,
problem.
I forget the company, but
And then on the inside, you have the problem that none of the people have actually been to a high enough management level that you can confidently predict that they will develop and learn the other skills that they haven't shown so far.
Well, and that's what I was just going to ask. I remember, I forget the name of the company, but it had a CFO, and it actually went out of its way to place the CFO on, I believe it was the board of Vodafone, or was it Bertelsmann? It was a European company, precisely to expose that potential candidate internationally in advance of when he would come up as a candidate. And I'm wondering how you go about the expectations for your CEO. Do you actually go through a review and say, the top 10 people, I mean, look at Susan. Susan's on the board of a public company. Do you as outside directors say to your CEO, look, our top 5 to 10 managers, we are going to allow them and encourage them, and we're going to find a public company board assignment for them precisely in order to begin to broaden their horizons and to start answering some of those questions so that they are more capable candidates. Are those things that you discuss with the CEO about developing the bench strength?
That is the expectation of a robust succession plan. Who are the 4 or 5 folks who could succeed you? What are their development gaps, and what are you doing to prepare them to take over for you? And then you monitor that over time. I mean, that's just...
But is one of the steps you might frequently say, let's put them on a board of another company? Is that important?
That could be one. That could be one if they've had no exposure to what it takes to run a public company or really understand what an element of being public means.
Of course, that's not your choice. It's somebody else's anyway. You don't know what's going to happen.
Yes,
But these days...
We have not done that, but that's a very interesting idea.
I mean, there's a lot of, it's not easy to get independent directors, particularly if they're willing to do audit committee work, and I think this was a CFO who was willing, they placed him actually on the audit committee of a very large company, and the trade-off was that person, but the trade-off was that person was therefore going to be in a very large European company when he had never had international exposure.
Oh, okay. Well,
And by the time he was ready to be CEO, that would be a win-win. There was the question.
Yeah.
Typically, you don't. I mean, today the trend is clearly against having more than one insider on the board, and typically the other insiders usually the CFO, who doesn't say very much anyway, when they sort of sit there. Because the point being, I think the point being that I guess traditionally when the CEO ran things, they would put their potential successor on the board, and the idea was that there was a nice chance to get them to meet the other directors, get them to meet them. But the world's changed. In a board-centric system, rather than a CEO-centric, that's really not necessary. I mean, why would they be on the board? The only point of having someone on the board is frankly the difference between being on the board and, let's say, being at the meeting is you got to vote. And what's the point of the vote? The vote is really only relevant in overseeing management. But as a CFO or COO or whatever, you're basically being asked to monitor your boss, which isn't very easy for you. So the point is, you don't do it. And that's why the trend is away from putting folks on boards unless they happen to be the CEO.
I don't know. I think I have a somewhat different view. If you really are getting close to some faith in a potential successor, you might well want to put that person on the board. You know, you don't have to have just all independent directors except the CEO and the CFO. I would say a
Just have
chief
majority.
Yeah, a comfortable majority I think is good enough, and sometimes it's very valuable to get the potential successor on the board, to learn how to deal with the board, and it's easier to get them to do that if they have some real role, a vote, and responsibility. It's not just sitting in the back of the room and then occasionally going up to the podium to give a presentation.
But Bob, their role, they can't be on a committee. I mean, an insider can't be on any of the committees.
Yeah, but you can bring them in front of a committee.
But they'll be in front of the committees anyway. I mean, typically your management team. I was on a board where the CFO was on the board, and it was actually always I was a dissident, so I could be a pain. And it was I had to be a dissident, yeah. And
I'm surprised.
yeah, it's just it's in the water. Being in Wilmington, no. And the CFO was always kind of amusing. The CFO, I thought it'd be interesting to see how would the CFO provide an appropriate, let's say, meter as to the effectiveness of the CEO. Looking at gauging his reactions, gauging his comments, and sometimes bouncing things off of him. And it never worked out. The individual very rarely said anything. And when he said anything, he was never going to say anything across the CEO because he was out of there very quickly.
But didn't you learn something from that about both the CEO and him? I mean, I think part of what Bob's saying is that psychologically, it's the difference between being at the children's table at Thanksgiving and at the adult table.
That's what
and
I
if the CEO and a couple of it used to be a couple of people in management were there. And Janet and I heard a memorable.
You want to see if the potential successor can display diplomatic honesty.
Yeah, and to see, and also to learn about your CEO and how he allows or she allows some of her subordinates to be adults too, in a way. I mean, didn't you learn something from that? I mean, clearly you learned that it doesn't work.
No, I'd like to say I did. What I learned was some good places to buy a good bottle of wine out in California. That was about it. Because I was distant, so he wasn't going to talk to me anyway. But no, the reaction was a strange one. I mean, I guess and I used to think about it. Okay, well, let me look at him. Let me look at other CFOs on boards I'm on that isn't on the board, and am I learning? Is there anything different? And the body language was basically the same. Whether if they thought something was harebrained, they'd kind of give a funny look. But whether they were on the board or off the board, it really was irrelevant. The question is, being on the board is a vote. That's all it is. And is the vote necessary? Because you're always going to be in the room. You're always going to be questioned. You're always going to be part of it, whether you are technically on or not. And I guess the question is the vote, are you giving the vote to someone who will ever buck the CEO? And the answer traditionally is no. Then if that's the point, then why have the vote? I guess you could argue, well, you give more responsibility, they make them feel better about themselves, but it's respectful to them, but they're there to represent the shareholders. You're not using the board as a grooming position. They're there to represent the owners of the company. The CEO's on the board because that's traditional in our country. In Taiwan, for instance, it's not the CEO doesn't serve on the board at all. The CEO is hired by the board. In this country, it developed that we put the CEO there because of we became a CEO-centric culture. But is that written in stone? And certainly if the CEO, is there, it's acceptable to have the CEO there now. But what about someone else? I don't see it anymore.
Edward, do you want to?
Well, we could go on.
What sort of succession planning process? What sort of steps your boards take in terms of conscious efforts to assure gender and ethnic and racial diversity in the candidate pool of succession?
I think that's a continual struggle, if you will. That is the area I work in my consulting business, with major corporations, helping them attract and retain women and minorities in senior jobs. So there is not a single company in this country that I would give a medal to, including the ones on whose boards I serve. So let me say that. We have not reached nirvana yet. Coming soon. So every single one could do better, if you will.
What are the process sort of things you do on the board to make it more likely that they're out of it?
Well, as one of the critical objectives of each one of my CEOs is they refer to the word diversity. I don't use the word diversity, but use inclusion. They have got to show that they are not just committed, I hate the word committed, but that there is action, if you will. Now, if you're talking about the board, turns out not just myself, but all of the boards are quite integrated that I'm on. They do better than the company does in each instance. So there's more than one minority or woman on each of the boards that I'm on. So one board has 3 women on it. And so we need to see that trickle down if that's the point that you're making here.
It can be.
I mean, for instance, in the university context, in the search committee, there will always be the question asked, have you looked at the woman candidate? You have a woman candidate on the short list, if not, why not stay with respect to it? It's a question that's asked explicitly within the university context. I'm curious whether there's the same level of explicit question, I guess.
It gets explicit. I'm not sure about levels, but yes, it does happen. I would say in terms of what's the pool and that you actually wind up looking at, it tends to, I think the biggest driver is the diversity on the board. It's kind of interesting. So for example, I mean, to take the obvious case, TIAA-CREF is about as diverse as you can get. It has a very high proportion of women and a lot of minorities. And amazingly, so did the candidate pool of 10 candidates was also very diverse.
Can I ask, and then I want to ask one question about outside advice to independent directors tends to be kind of important, given, especially about issues where there's conflicts, because you need to get the normal sources of information are disabled. To what extent do you use outside advice during the so-called succession period to help you evaluate as independent directors whether your succession planning system is really up to snuff?
I have not been, I haven't had too much experience in using outside consultants to assist in the succession planning, except there was one instance a few years ago with one of the boards that I'm on where the CEO had us send his evaluation, our evaluation of him, to a third party in Atlanta. And so as part of that evaluation, I put that I don't like sending this to you, whoever you are.
It was Ted
Because
Turner.
if, in fact, I have something that I wish to say to the CEO, I can say it directly to him. It was a him. And I'm uncomfortable with this third-party interface. It seemed as if the CEO could not accept the evaluations of him by us unless they were filtered through this third party. That ended, by the way, because I and others complained about that process. It needed to be more direct. We're talking about 10 board members, we'll say, and one CEO. We could all sit in one room and do the evaluation.
I haven't experienced this yet, hiring a separate outside consultant for the succession planning part. I mean, you do have,
Well,
in the
here's
companies I know, the comp committee will have an independent consulting firm that advises it during executive session and does no other work for the company, and you'll have the same thing when you do the search.
Well, and that's
You
what I
look
was
for a
asking.
search firm.
Well, that's what I was asking about, Bob.
You
Is
probably prefer not to have a search firm that is doing general HR searches for your company.
Well, no.
Although, well, that's hard because
right, but what I was,
so small.
is it struck me when we discussed it that you said that the period for in a non-crisis situation when you're going to hire a CEO, say you've got some good inside candidates, you've got some outside candidates, it's going to be a couple months.
Yeah.
That you're really heavily reliant on the search firm to some extent to help you with the outside stuff.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if this is really the importance of it, wouldn't it be useful every couple years to check in with the leading search firm, maybe have one on a thing, who give you an update about how your inside candidates are doing?
More work for experts. Yeah.
Well, it is more work, but if you're actually going to be dependent on them to do your outside check anyway,
that's
if you
true.
keep it more seasonable, I just wonder whether anybody does that, or
Not that I know.
and would it freak out your CEO?
Yeah, it probably would, but picking a search firm is a big deal. I can tell you that.
Oh, so picking the firm would be
Yeah, I think in our we had day-long interview, 2-hour interviews with 5 firms doing their show and tell why they would be good for the search kind of thing. So, but no reason in principle you couldn't do it on an ongoing
Do McKinsey
basis.
or
I
any of
don't know
these
anyone
people?
that-
I mean, they'll sell you anything, and they got good PowerPoints. Do they do any of this? I mean, I say that they sell high-quality, good stuff. I love it. If I could afford it, I'd buy it myself.
It's called paralysis through analysis.
Right, but
And
how
that
do you
can
know?
happen. That can definitely happen.
But isn't sometimes getting an into? I guess what I'm asking is, how do you know you're doing it well if you can't rely on management to tell you, and it does sound like it's a difficult job, and how do you do a check on yourself? I guess is what I'm asking. If you don't get outside advice.
You always have outside advice. The shareholders either elect you or they don't re-elect you. They think you're doing a lousy job at it.
That's maybe our segue. I guess the answer is that's our segue to crisis replacement. Right. So, crisis replacement. Charles,
Well, how do I begin? No,
Where do we begin?
where do I begin? No, I was only at this at once. Actually, there were 2 of us, and we both got on, and we ended up. The CEO did move on, and we went from dissidents to a majority. And anyway, but the CEO succession process, as I said, is board driven, and a crisis that's obviously the most evident. The big thing there, I think, in a crisis can be you lose confidence in the CEO, and you decide it's time for them to go. The CEO dies. The CEO calls you on a Friday afternoon and says, "I'm leaving effective immediately. Goodbye." And what do you do? And that's where I think where the strong bench is really very important. I was on a board where we had we didn't have a strong bench, as it turned out, within, and we had to go outside the organization on an emergency basis. Actually, I think you're serving on a board now with the fellow we brought in. And the problem was that was one reason for the CEO's termination, because he didn't develop a strong bench. He was very difficult to work with, and not a lot of folks were in the organization. At the time that we did terminate him, we were in the middle of a COO search, and we had thought at the time we could ramp up the COO search, and use that person, because when we terminated the CEO, we also terminated the CFO at the same time. And so we were going to ramp that up, and it turns out the company had some real problems, and we had to bring in someone from the outside as an interim, and then actually quite quickly as the full-time and permanent replacement, and it worked out all right. But that convinced me from that point on that how important it was to have a good bench, and sort of thinking about this on a relatively regular basis. What if? Who will I move, or we will move into this position in the event something happens? And since that occurred, I've been involved, I guess, in 3 other quote-unquote crisis successions, and we did have some good folks in, and we were able to either bring someone in one case in on an interim basis, and then we brought who held the thing together until we could do a full-scale search, and brought someone in from the outside. In the other cases, we had folks from within the organization who we were able to promote up into the CEO slot, and one was interim and became CEO. Yeah, and both were interim and eventually became CEO. Again, it's completely situational, but the takeaway was that you got to be thinking about this continually if that happens. It's interesting. A lot of people say, a board, boards are now too quick to get rid of CEOs that aren't performing. They're too quick to pull the trigger. And that actually is really the furthest from the truth, because for a board, an emergency succession is a nightmare, because suddenly you are stuck running that thing, at least temporarily, even until you bring someone else in, until it stabilizes. And the can of worms that opens up is really quite dramatic. It's when you move a CEO along, it's like lifting the rock up, all the bugs crawl out, and you assume there were some bugs in there, but then the rock comes up, and then they all appear. And every time this has happened, it happens. There's always something you didn't know about, and then they leave, and then you suddenly know about it. But I think the point is that you don't do it lightly, and when you do it, it's important to have someone in mind, either, again, interim, or if in fact you've got someone you think can lead the company permanently, to go from interim to permanent.
Can I ask you guys about who the person typically is? It a member of management who's typically the crisis CEO designee, or is it the lead director? And how, we've seen some lead directors be as ingenious as, remember the most ingenious vice presidential search of all time, which is by the current vice president, which I searched long and hard, and it's very clear that the person who should be in line to the White House is me. And I'm wondering how these lead director successions are playing into CEOs' relationships to boards, because in a few of the situations, Charles, some of the lead directors seemed more like they viewed it as an opportunity than as a real burden to step in.
Well,
so I'm wondering how you're dealing with
Let
that.
me ask you a factual question, Charles. I mean, is this something that happens in your experience, or observation of emergency successions, that it's a lead director who comes in and stays there, other than temporarily?
No, I've only heard of
I've never
one.
heard of-
There's only I think there was an article in the Journal a couple of weeks ago about lead directors who acting from the board
They'll
who
be the
became
acting
permanent
CEO, and they can't wait to get.
Yeah, there was one at
rid of it.
Zales. I think it happened at Zales, and there was another one at what was the other company? There have been, I think, like 2 or 3, but no, it's rare. I mean,
That's
look,
what I think.
Nobody
Yeah.
wants
Doesn't
that
happen.
job.
Pretty rare.
Yeah, nobody wants that job.
And that's so who does take over usually when there's a crisis? Someone has to be fired, or a little financial turmoil, for example.
You typically will split the chair CEO role, and you put as chair of the board will be an independent director. Typically, will take that role. And it depends
until you get this
until you get someone. Now, when you bring someone in, they may or may not want the chairmanship. A lot do. Some say no. I want to keep it split. At HealthSouth, we've kept the two split. By our governance guidelines, we split the two. The CEO came in, and the acting chair of the board was an independent director in that circumstance. The acting CEO was an independent director as well, until a process was underway, and they brought someone in who became permanent CEO. The acting did not want it. It said, "Look, I will do this temporarily," but that was a company that had massive financial fraud, and justice was there and everybody else. But again, it all depends on the situation. You can't, one size doesn't fit all. Typically, if a CEO is removed, the chair of the board does become, for at least an interim period, an independent director. And
But
you
the
do typically split them.
the CEO designee, is that typically a manager in the crisis plan?
You mean the acting CEO?
Yes.
The acting CEO?
Yes.
It's typically-
Not unless it's an older person who's very senior and whom everyone understands will not be the permanent new CEO. Then you might use that person rather than, say, the chairman of the board.
Well, yeah, you don't have it written down.
be-
There's nothing that's written in a book. Let's break open, the old Maxwell Smart.
I'm talking about, again, the person, the infelicitous street crossing decision. That you cross streets like a Bostonian, Bob, which Bob knows means you have no semblance of any idea what you're doing. You just do it at any time. And unlike New Yorkers who actually know how to cross the street. So you got your Bostonian is hit in New York, and everybody applauds because he was blocking the box or something. And then the board, you all told me that
The emergency succession
yes. So who
plan.
is the emergency CEO? Is it a manager? And what I mean is a manager, someone who is paid to be a full-time employee of the company, or is it a member of the board?
In most of my
Depends.
instances, it's been a member of the management team.
Okay.
You say manager, but it's a senior management person.
Right.
Now, does that depend upon the circumstances? I would think
Right.
clearly if it's a
Right.
case where the team has not been doing well,
Right. It could happen that the reason you fire the CEO is a scandal that involves the person you had as
Right.
number 2 on the succession plan.
But
The
absent a
emergency
scandal
succession.
and absent the opportunity to have a board member, an independent board member, step in as acting CEO, and that's a huge job that was not available, for example, with anybody on the board of Sprint. We named the CFO.
to what extent does the
Yeah.
board feel at all responsible when there's been a unexpected successorship problem that emerges because of bad performance? To what extent does the board say to themselves, gee, this was partly our fault?
They should say it. It is partly their fault. So it's certainly absent any sort of succession plan, if you will, and oversight, if you want to call it that, of the CEO. It does rest with the board. So
You know,
Board service, I think, is very much different than it was 18 years ago. It is arduous. There's more responsibility, more accountability. You've mentioned ISS. As irritating as they have been to me, they exist and have a, you know, they have a voice, if you will, as well as other shareholders. You talk about forces that come to bear. I'm on boards that are heavily invested in by companies, by hedge funds. Unbelievable demands put on us. I'm surprised I'm even here today, that I am not somewhere being demanded to do something. So that the world has changed, if you will, even within the last 2 to 3 years, let alone 18 years. It's just not the same as it once was. It truly is almost a full-time job. By the way, someone mentioned here about members of management, as Susan does from her company, serving on corporate boards, and I'm familiar with that with a few fellow board members, especially at Wendy's, who are not CEOs, but are senior executives at Walgreens, at Best Buy, and they do a tremendous job. But there's also the issue of our CEO serving on another board. And the time commitment, not to mention the exposure, so to speak, is huge. So we have to make a dedicated decision. It's the decision of the independent directors as to whether our CEO can be permitted to serve on another corporate board.
And that's an important issue when you're hiring a new CEO. You really ask them to get off their other boards.
Of course, if they're on another board and that other board is involved in a scandal, it may come back to influence and affect their ability to effectively run your organization as well.
Well, and then we should open up the questions if we can, but what's different about the crisis replacement process? I mean,
you throw up.
And how do
Sorry.
you
throw up now.
Well, but how do you do it, and how is it different? I mean, how do you not get unduly rushed, for example?
But you are rushed. I mean, there's a crisis. So someone, as you said, has died, or they've walked out, or the moment of truth has come, and it's time for him or her to go.
Just like
so there's
any
an
other
emergency meeting, and the meeting is called for tonight at 11 o'clock at night. That's when it happens, by the way, because they can't get everyone together. So it happens when you wish you were asleep.
You get that horrible phone call, you know, that morning, and suddenly you realize that this is going to be quite a show. I mean, the worst of that I heard of, I think, was the HealthSouth. I wasn't on the board at the time. HealthSouth, when the FBI showed up and they arrested everybody. They came in and took records, and the CEO was then subsequently indicted. I mean, that was a bad one.
Well, he was victimized.
Well, he was
acquitted.
Well, he was acquitted of Sarbanes-Oxley, though he was convicted of robbery. So that's
but he had 19 subordinates who, despite his good faith efforts at supervision, committed felonies.
That was his defense. Yeah.
Actually,
I wasn't there.
But it comes down to a very simple discipline, which is have a crisis management plan in place, so that if something untoward happens to the CEO, you know who's going to do what when. Right. And if it's not going to be pleasant, and it is rushed, but if you've got at least some pre-thinking and with very specific who's going to do what, it's manageable.
Do you think there'd be two very different situations? One where the CEO dies or something like that, which is a contingency that could always happen, and ought to be planning for it in terms of what do you do if something like that happens, as differentiated from things have screwed up.
Right.
And it's a very different situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, again, using the Wendy's board, in 1996, the CEO, Jim Neer, dropped dead at the Olympics in Atlanta. And so we replaced him, and that was a crisis situation for us, and there was an emergency phone call. There was and I'm sorry I've forgotten at this moment who it was put in an interim, and we selected someone from within the company. That individual we selected was 50 years old, and he was doing a very good job when he dropped dead in 1999 on Christmas Eve at home with his 13-year-old daughter. And so we had to do this again, if you will. There was not there was a crisis in the sense that we were shocked in each instance, but there wasn't a crisis in the company.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting distinction, because I think the felt need to do something rather quickly, to feel rushed, is probably greater when there's been a crisis in the company, because among other things, your new CEO selection is going to be a kind of signal to the market, yes, we've got this under control, we're dealing with it. And so I think the risk is of feeling rushed and making a bad decision might actually be greater in that situation.
Well, at the risk of digression, I think we actually we skipped over something relevant to this thing, which was very important in terms of the bench planning. The tenure of a CEO when you select her. How do you think about that in relationship to succession? Because if you actually pick someone who's going to be there, who's going to stay for 15 years, there's other people who are going to leave. Mm-hmm. And how do you, when you select a CEO, how do you think about the tenure you expect of that person in relationship to the management? Because many people forget, in the Disney case, for example, one of the reasons why it came about was the tragedy involving, a very able potential successor who had something awful happen. But when managers stay for 15 years, who knows what your cycle is? Do you guys think about this and plan for this?
I think about it. I think it's desirable as a general matter when you're getting a new CEO to try to come to some understanding of the runway, the term. Not all CEOs going to want to do that, and maybe they shouldn't all. But I sort of like the biblical 7, as a kind of target, and maybe a few years beyond that. But you don't give them a contract that long, obviously. But you do try to get some understanding how long this is going to be. So, because that's very important to the succession planning and talent development. I don't know.
Edward?
Charles?
As part of the succession planning, as part of the development of successions, what do you know about the health?
It's very interesting. After that second one, we went through a complete health analysis of every one of the final candidates, if you will. And Jack Schuessler, who was chosen in 1999 as our CEO, we even made sure that he was in a health program, if you will. And he's fine. He's still alive today. He's doing fine.
It's like a rough job.
Yeah.
Is that general? I mean, given what I can do with the company,
Yeah.
is it general?
No.
We hadn't done it before then.
I'm not aware that it's done very often, but it's an interesting point.
Actually, it happened at McDonald's too. Same thing.
Same thing did
Two
happen
guys dropped dead.
about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe
It
it's
was a
fast.
little bit
Maybe
more
it's
of a
fast food.
crisis.
I don't know.
Well, it was a little bit more of a crisis at McDonald's, it turned out, than it was for us, because I don't know what their succession planning.
I had a friend who was on the board.
Right. Yeah, but even in that kind of situation where it might actually be rational not to push it too much, you can always pull the old "what if you're hit by a truck" routine. We got to have this emergency plan. We want the best people in line, and who's number 2, who's 3, who's 4, and let's assess them. Not a complete solution.
Bob, I wonder if I could put you on the spot for a minute. You have a lot of portfolio companies where I think there must be board replacement issues quite frequently. Does Blackstone itself have a way of handling this that it then proposes to the companies that it controls? What's the MO? What's the MO you follow to replace the person you're taking out?
Interesting.
Casey?
Going back to the public company, how does the process get drawn or facilitated if there are hedge fund activist representatives on the board who are representing investors like that? One of the things opposed to the norm where you're there to hire or oversee the hedge fund folks, they know how to do things better than just curious as to how that is.
Well, I can say that I'm on the Wendy's board. We have 9 board members, including the CEO, so that's the only inside person, 8 outsiders, and 3 individuals put on by Mr. Nelson Peltz. We did that to forestall a proxy fight a few years ago. Very nice gentleman, probably the 3 members of the board I prefer to have a beer with. But every board meeting is difficult. So I do go into training prior to every meeting.
And
I have to. So
And
it's
are
changed the nature of the board, if you will.
And-
There's no question that they represent the interests of Nelson Peltz. I feel I represent the interests of all of the shareholders, including Nelson Peltz, and that is a distinction.
And do these discussions revolve to a significant extent around CEO succession, or who should?
I'd say no. And by the way, they were present for the vote and voted for the present CEO, who is a woman, by the way. No, it's more about the performance of the company, about the use of our cash, things of that sort.
Again, it varies on the holder, who's there and what kind of pressure they put on. When I was a dissident, it was a takeover, and it was the company that nominated me was really, I was independent of them. I just, went on with I wasn't a management candidate for the board, put it that way. And then once the 2 of us were elected, they effectively disappeared. In fact, they were taken over by another company and left us sitting there, which was kind of interesting too. But I think actually one of your partners represented them at the time. Anyway, but I think, on a board now with a large investor, ESL, Eddie Lampert, owns a good chunk of AutoZone, and obviously his views are important, and he owns a lot of the company, and you can't. On the other hand, your role as a director is to represent, I think you articulated effectively, everybody. You're not there to represent one person or another person. You're there for everyone. I think that puts representatives of these hedge funds in a particularly tough spot when they go on the board, because they obviously have a viewpoint, and their employers could ask them no longer to be on the board. But from a fiduciary standpoint, they're to represent everyone, and I think that would be a pretty unpleasant place to be. I'd much rather be an independent coming on from a fund than someone from the fund itself coming on.
I want to get a question in from Greg, but I want to ask one follow-up on this, Janet. And I've heard it from that one of the problems for having some of these, ISS takes the view, as I understand it, that they'll recommend more easily for a short slate on the view that it's good to get a diversity of viewpoints in the boardroom. What I've heard, though, is that it's difficult when you get these short slates elected to get the members of those short slates to actually participate and own decisions of the board on the ongoing matters before the board. They'll be happy to tell you about balance sheet issues and leveraging up. Does the succession planning, and this is to all 4 of you, does it sort of stop because 3 members of the board actually won't really talk about the question of developing bench strength and all this kind of stuff?
No, I didn't mean to imply that.
No, and I wasn't saying about
We
Wendy's in particular.
talk about succession planning. We don't talk about it, unfortunately, at every single meeting, as you do. I wish we did. But it is on the agenda at least once, if not twice a year. I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's twice. And they are very involved. And the Nelson Peltz board members put on by Nelson Peltz serve on committees. That is a requirement, if you will. from the rest of us. Because otherwise, the burden of serving on committees would have fallen just on the 9 of us, or the 8 of us, if you will. That would be unfair.
Well, I haven't had the experience, fortunately. In the 8 boards I've been on, none have had these dissidents.
Usually they're, you know, dissidency will be on a particular issue or two, but most of the decisions that come before a board are pretty routine. And frankly, the board has to act as a unified body. And there are going to be decisions where the dissident will disagree, but typically they're usually pretty savvy folks, or usually polite and interested in the company itself. I noticed, what was it, on Kraft the other day, was it Frank Zarb, just on the Kraft board, coming from, I think it was from Pelt, which was interesting because Frank Zarb was chairman of AIG, and no one could accuse Frank of being a wild and crazy guy when it comes to, you know, going on boards. He's an establishment figure who's been on a number of boards and run a number of big companies. So I don't think that the notion of, quote, dissidency in and of itself
But it's funny,
is
I
problematic.
don't call these dissidents. I don't think of them as dissidents.
No.
They have come to the board, however, differently than the rest of us.
Through a different
So
process.
there's no question
That's
about
true.
that.
That's a good point.
Greg?
Listening to the discussion planning, it seemed to be implicit in the discussion that you had willing participant and a good faith partner in the CEO in that process. Is that the case unanimously, or have you had occasions where your CEOs have been reluctant participants, and if so, what do you do to bring them along and make them feel in peaceful?
Well, if you can't bring them along, you can fire them. So that's the ultimate answer, if you will. I don't have an interim answer, I'm sorry.
I have not experienced a case of a CEO resisting the process. But I assume such things happen. I think I've been very fortunately. I do think there's a more subtle risk that's somewhat a reduced version of this, which is CEOs might have their own favored internal candidates that they really think, you know, ought to be considered, and that's a tricky matter. You know, if you have a search committee that doesn't share the judgment, I suspect that's a fairly common situation. CEOs like the people they brought in; they like the people who are like themselves. The board might very well feel, no, we need something different now.
I also sense less than a sense of urgency to get it done right. And the board had to push that say, no, we need to do this now. We're not going to wait 6 months or a year from now. So,
Well, Bob, you in your opening remarks, I think, touched on this, which is, I think what Greg's saying is there might be more subtle things, which is the CEO's been in office for 3 years, doesn't seem to have a very high opinion of anyone in terms of bench strength.
Right.
Doesn't seem to be bringing them along. How do you overcome that as a practical matter and sort of make clear, you know, not, Janet said you could fire them, but something maybe short of that where you say to the CEO, really, this is an important part of your job, get on with it, fella, or we are going to have to start getting. Have you confronted situations like that where you've had to have these kind of talks? And how do you deal with it? Or has all the CEOs been magnificent?
no, that becomes a performance discussion and gets down into the compensation discussion.
Who has that discussion with the CEO? The lead director, or who does it?
The lead director representing the compensation committee and the board.
Right.
Or sometimes, I mean, it's happened where the entire independent directors together
Right.
meet.
Do you ever send a compensation signal? Like, gee, indispensability is actually an argument for managerial failure, not achievement after 4 years. And
Well, I think
we're-
some
we're-
companies do that.
Yeah, you
In
can read
terms
about
of
that all the time.
the factors that are considered in determining the compensation, the bonus, you have one of the elements is handling succession planning.
we're going to finish with 2 questions. We're going to go with the student and then.
My question relates to relationships and particularly the context of succession planning. It appears that there's a very robust and thorough analysis of all the possible candidates for the CEO inside and outside. To what extent are relationships either between board members and possible candidates or between the CEO and insiders, board members and insiders play a role in succession planning or in the succession choosing process?
Well, my experience, I don't think there's too much in terms of board members' relationships with the candidates and the examples I've seen. With respect to the CEO, there's obvious, the point I was just making, CEOs tend to favor some of the people they brought in and groomed and think are just fantastic. So there's that. But I don't see that as a major problem with the search committees or boards.
I mean, there's always going to be relationships. I think it's a question of understanding what type of relationships, how deep they are, and make sure it doesn't bias the decision.
Right. I would say there's more of a risk that people just favor candidates who are like themselves, but they don't quite realize it. It's sort of like the presidential elections, you know. It just isn't it an interesting fact that, you know, looking at the demographics, older white women tend to favor Hillary Clinton, and younger people, the other guy, what's his name, Barack, and who I.
How do you define older white women?
I was good at this presentation.
I don't want to go there. I just know it's true, though, as an analytic matter, and I think you see something like that on boards, that different committee members or board members will tend to favor different candidates for reasons they don't fully understand themselves. And I think
when it comes to internal candidates, I think that board members hopefully know who those internal candidates are and can make an independent judgment about him or her and their ability to lead the company. Now, here's where an independent board member can have negative power, because they can step forward and say, I do not have confidence in him to run the company. Then that puts a damper, if you will, on what could be a bit of a train on its way, if you will, to naming that individual as the CEO. I've seen that happen. So usually obviously they want consensus, and that's one thing they want consensus on the most in the boardroom. Because we can have disagreements in the boardroom, but we want to agree on the person who's going to be the CEO. That's very important.
Good question over here.
Yes.
Speaking of compensation, have you ever seen any circumstance where the board has imposed either a restriction on sale of stock or a restriction on the exercise of options as a means of aligning the CEO with the succession plan? Meaning that there's alignment if the CEO knows he's got 1 million shares of stock that he can't sell for 5 years, so he's going to want the best person to increase the value of the stock as opposed to what it's growing.
You know, he said early on in your list that there are several reasons, and you would have to repeat them because they were so good the way you put it, that CEOs resist doing this. Some of it is ego, and they feel that they don't want the board, many don't want the board to become confident in someone else internally, if you will, for fear that if there's a stumble, they will get rid of the CEO and name that other person. The long-term issue that you're talking about here in terms of stock options, for some reason that doesn't enter in at all. I've not seen any CEOs who are thinking ahead as you're suggesting here.
Well, but we
give them some incentive in making sure the company performs well after they're gone.
But we do know, and it's interesting, this is an academic point, that the classic story had been, you know, watch the capstone deal when the CEO is turning 65. And colleagues of Bob at Harvard confirmed the basic story, but with a different point, which was CEOs tended to propose capstone deals not when they were hit a particular age, but when they hit the natural period of time
for renewal
and where they're not. And how do you deal with that in your succession planning, which is a sort of related, because what you're saying is a means to get beyond that, so the CEO doesn't think he's the sucker when the successor comes in and sells the company or does something. You know, have you thought about that study, Bob, in terms of how it affects your view of succession planning, since you know the study well? And
no. I'm confused about it, what to do with it, you know, whether to, because I like the idea of having a specified runway and maybe some targeted period where they're up for the second round.
Well, when they come to you with transactional
but if
ID,
you have that, then you have the problem you're talking about.
Well, when they come to you with
when they're coming up for the key evaluation, not the annual, but
just
the
because
5-year, then they're going to try to sell the company or something stupid.
Because everybody would be upset if we didn't touch on takeovers to some extent. If the CEO comes to you at year 6 or year 5, and you've had your plan, your runway out there, And he's met Bob Friedman, who's a very charming and persuasive guy, and Casey was just along with him too. And somehow it just seems to be a wonderful time to go private.
Right.
Does it ever cross any of your mind? Well, wait a minute. Gee, we had a runway for the CEO, and it seems to have a lot less room on it. Do we need to be skeptical of his motives?
Well, I think you have to be skeptical if he has a change of control agreement that's going to pay him, I'll pick a number, $150 million if there's a change in control. But it's not going to pay that if he retires, if he's fired, if he dies, whatever. But anyway, any other circumstance, so to speak. So now that I've been confronted with, if you will. So, but that gets to those CEOs who happen to have a change in control.
Well, in terms of Leo's question, it does seem to be a pattern in terms of sales of companies that take place at certain periods of time.
Right, it is a pattern.
And I would think in terms of the successorship discussion we've had, it really does pose the elephant in the ointment in terms of whether successorship planning is working, or whether the CEO at the end of the day just takes it and runs with it in his own direction.
Because sometimes, isn't Janet the motive? It's not that the CEO necessarily wants to trigger a shoot, but running a company is an important part of her identity, and it's important to her, and it's sometimes difficult to give up the reins, right?
Or maybe it's easier, maybe what you're saying is that there's the CEO who feels it's easier to sell the company than run the company.
There's that, and then there's also to whom you sell, right?
Well,
because that could lengthen your reign. How about last thoughts from any of you on how this thing works, or takeaways for the audience? Susan, you want to start? We'll go down the line.
I'm just going to ask you where you find all these women CEOs.
It's a hopeful. Actually, it's my approach to not saying him or her the whole time is to just alternate gender. And so, but it has an aspirational. It doesn't have it has a certain aspirational quality. And my mother's a woman executive, so she likes to hear that of her son.
No, I think the conversation has been very rich, and I look forward to continuing it over dinner. I've learned a lot, and I don't have anything else to add.
Well, I sort of am where I started. I think it's very important. I think we can make it better by being careful about process. But I really wish someone would figure out how we can predict reliably, systemically, based on empirical evidence and studies, who's going to be a successful CEO.
Now, I'll piggyback on that challenge because we don't have any empirical measurement stick, if you will, to do that. So that would be wonderful. That's the nirvana.
I think the key has got to be it has to be board driven, and you have to have directors who are independent, honest, and have a real stake in the company itself in making that decision. And that's the best hope you've got. No decisions can be perfect, and that's why we have the business judgment rule. I mean, you've got human beings, and they do the best they can. The key is to ensure that they are doing in fact the best they can for the right reasons, which is why I think independence and ownership is really, to me, critical to the whole thing.
On behalf of Leo and myself, let me thank you for educating us and doing a wonderful job at it. The dinner follows, and there will be discussion over dinner to continue what we've started here. And you know what floor it's on? In the third floor, and we will be going directly from here to there. Join me in thanking the panel for the
audience.